Hello everyone, it's Sasha here again. We are continuing the contact series. This is part 3 of the quantum contact map. Because we're going to move on from what we've talked about in parts 1 and 2, we really do recommend that you watch parts 1 and 2 because it's likely you may not understand what we are referring to from those parts. All right, so as a reminder, the quantum contact map is a metaphor. And it is a metaphor that is describing the shift of consciousness that is necessary as one moves deeper and deeper into the contact process, the true contact process, which is also at the same time mirroring the awakening process itself. This is why when we speak about contact, we are not talking about what you have come to know from your movies as being a ship landing and an ET getting out and you say hello or you shake hands. It's not something so simplified as that. But the true contact idea is, as the original book was called, a metamorphosis of consciousness. Therefore, the quantum contact map is discussing this metamorphosis of consciousness. Okay, so to review super quickly, and we're not going to spend time on what we've already covered in the previous parts, we've talked about the nature of reality and how the physical reality that you know of as a human and who have come to believe is like the main reality is actually more akin to the idea of the old style movie reels, where you have flashes of physicality, but the real juice, so to speak, is actually the spaces between. For it is the spaces between those projections into physical reality from the one consciousness, that's where you, in a sense, merge once again with your true nature. So therefore, if we are to look at this as a map, ideally, as you move, quote unquote, higher on the map, it is representing not only the change in consciousness, but also the things that you must encounter on the way toward this shift of consciousness that brings about much more meaningful contact. All right, so you can review some of this in part 1 and part 2. But we have the red band here, which we've referred to in the past as the pain and fear band. This is what often gets triggered as you begin to go into the quantum nature of your consciousness, because it is representing, in a sense, the things that have not been looked at, the things that have been pushed in the closet, so to speak. And these things are a mirror for you in which to see yourself. So the pain and fear band then, people experience it in a different way, can act like a mirror, and you can hear more about that in previous parts. Then we go to the green line here, which is what we've called in the past the jelly band. This is referring to, well, we made the joke that we're not very creative when we label things. We labeled it jelly band because very often it feels like jelly when you're moving through this part of the map. So as you get then deeper and deeper into the contact experience, people experience different things, but very often it can feel like a very thick energy. We are so thrilled to see that in your movie from the 1990s with Jodie Foster called Contact, that when she had the contact on the beach with her so-called father, that they depicted this jelly band as being very jelly-like as she was coming closer and closer and closer to meeting the ET with the face of her father. Hope we haven't spoiled anything for you. All right, so therefore, the jelly band then you can see is really the first beginnings of the attunement to the quantum energy. So it is here that consciousness begins to rapidly shift, and it begins to, in a sense, disidentify with the ego, the human ego you, and begin to more identify with the universal you. All right, so that kind of catches us up very briefly from the past two parts. Now we're going to look at something that we hinted at in part two, which was about what begins to happen in those upper levels on the quantum contact map. We talked about in the previous section about how group consciousness begins to show up, so to speak, in the contact process. So those of you who allow yourself to go very, very deeply into contact, and you may perhaps have gone past the stage where you are meeting individualized beings, but now what you're meeting is very difficult to define because it's gone out of individuation and it's beginning to move into a more integrated, more rarefied state of consciousness that we can define at the first level as group consciousness. So what we've drawn here then is some circles that are kind of side by side, and this is meant to be an example for what we're talking about group consciousness. So first level group consciousness, then, you could say, is comprised of a group of beings that can relate as individuals but also as a group. So their frequency is very harmonious, but yet they can still, even if it is a little bit, have some type of individuation within their expression. So that would be the first level then, as you have gone deeper and deeper into the quantum field in terms of your consciousness, you're going to meet this first layer of group energies. And very often this is a place where most humans stop moving deeper, because the deeper levels start to get more confusing and they start to perhaps wander away from what the human understanding of contact is, and because of that confusion, then very often the human ego wants to keep you maybe a little bit in a safer zone, so to speak, that's more understandable. But for the purposes of understanding how contact and the awakening process are very similar, we're going to keep going on this map so you can see, in a sense, the end result. All right? So that's the first level of group consciousness. Now you're going to see we have level number 2 here. And this time we have the circles slightly overlapping. We're going to label, whereby we've labeled number 1 as group, we're going to label number 2 as collective consciousness. So there's a slight nuance then between group consciousness and collective consciousness. What is that nuance? Well, you can see then that there is an overlap, which means then that the more dominant experience for consciousness at this level is not individuation anymore. It is what is being experienced in those overlapping realms. You could say then, taking the metaphor further, that the deeper and deeper you go on the map, that those overlapping areas begin to be the dominant areas. And therefore, the idea of individual beings is becoming something very, very rare at this level of consciousness. The individual idea is such a small percentage, whereby the overlapping areas of the collective become the majority of the experience. So if you are having a contact experience then where you've gone to some of these deep levels, it might seem confusing. because there's not an orientation of individuality anymore. You might still be aware of yourself as your singular being, but the collective you, the you that is actually part of the collective of the consciousness of the universe, begins to override, let's say, the individual consciousness that you are as a human being. And that can be very disorienting and very confusing for humans. So now we've, in this experience, we've gone well beyond what you've come to know as contact from your movies. This is now showing you the road of consciousness integration, of recognizing yourself as part of a universal collective. And from our point of view, this is the main reason for doing contact work. Because, as we've said in the past, seeing the ships in the sky and all of that is fun, but ultimately, what is the purpose? The deeper purpose is seeing yourself in the others that are contacting you and recognizing that universal one consciousness is really just looking at aspects of itself. All right, so that's going to lead us then to the third layer here. And the third layer, we're going to again use a metaphor to describe. When we get to these rarefied experiences, as we've said many times, metaphor is really the only way to describe things. So here we've drawn they're like a Vesica Pisces shape. So they're the overlapping areas of the second level here of the collective. Of course, we have to use a two-dimensional surface, so we do the best we can. It's not a two-dimensional experience. So when these areas of overlap happen, those areas of overlap have kind of what you might call nodal points. These are the very direct connections the consciousness is making where there is absolutely no differentiation between consciousness. It is two different forms or two different aspects becoming one, or in the process of becoming one. So we've drawn red dots to denote those nodal points. And now in the second diagram here, we've removed the black lines so you can just see these little dots that are representing the idea of this blended consciousness beginning to express one idea. So what is that one idea? Okay, so it's going to seem like we're going to take a tangent, but not really. We'll tie it up at the end. Here we have a piece of cardboard. And we don't know if you can see it with the camera or not, but there is a hole in the center of the cardboard. So when you, as a human, are aware of yourself as a soul having a human experience, it is much like the idea, metaphorically speaking, of your soul looking through this one single hole into a physical reality and having a physical life. That's a metaphor for that experience that you've understood up until now is what happens in the incarnation process. But we're going to take it a step further. So here on the map, we've drawn an eye at the top. That eye is representing the one consciousness that you are. Now, we're not talking about the one Bob or the one Sally. We're talking about the one that is Bob, that is Sally, that is Ron. That is what is represented by the eye. It is, you can say, the ultimate experience of reintegration back to the source. Okay? So, we have here another cardboard. This time, there are many holes punched in the cardboard. And we're going to use this as a metaphor to describe something to you. So if this eye here is representing the one, and I look through the cardboard into physical reality, it is as if every little hole is an eye. And all of those little holes have their own experience in physical reality, perhaps slightly different, slightly askew from the other person's experience. But this is a very simple metaphor to show you the idea that there is only but one I, or one consciousness, separating itself, viewing itself in different trajectories, in different lifetimes. So when you are working with the contact experience, ultimately, you are going to bump up against this idea if you take it very far, because you will be moving backwards, so to speak, the way you came, moving backwards toward integration rather than through separation, which is this process. Therefore, when you're moving backwards, you start to encounter, so to speak, all these seemingly separate eyes or separate dots through which the one is viewing itself. This is when you start to understand what we call superposition contact. So, this idea of the many dots then is representing superposition. Now, we have made the joke at a workshop previously that this channel, Lyssa, has no dictionary for quantum physics. And because of that, Sasha is a little bit limited in how we express things. Therefore, we just use metaphor. The metaphor is then that these overlapping areas of consciousness and the nodal points that overlap and become the hot spots, so to speak, that is representing the very beginnings of the idea of superposition consciousness. Superposition consciousness means beginning to recognize that there is only one consciousness viewing through many eyes into the physical reality. Now, this is not an intellectual aha. It is actually a more experiential aha. Intellectual can come first, but when you have the experiential aha, such as through meditation or through contact work, it shifts everything. It, in a sense, attunes you to continue to go deeper into experiencing this kind of contact. Okay, so now if you're moving on the map and you are getting to the place where you are experiencing superposition contact, what does that look like? What it looks like, or what it feels like, is the experience of no longer being human-centric, having a contact experience, but instead being able to experience yourself as ETs or other forms of consciousness in many forms through many times. To use simple lingo, so to speak, it is when you meet a future self, or when you meet a parallel self, as you have come to call them, other yous and other bodies. Now, up until now, you have come to see that if you meet a future self, oh, that's my future self, that's the ego's future self. In reality, though, every single being you meet at this very high level of contact is literally another you. Not another you from the human perspective, another you from the one perspective. So this is why the issue of contact can be such an important process for the evolution of consciousness, because as you let yourself open to the contact process and you move deeper and deeper through the quantum map, confronting all of your fears and your pains and releasing them, and moving more into an integrative state where you embrace all aspects of the one, then the idea of contact itself begins to change, because you're no longer contacting something out there, like an ET in the sky. You are instead bringing parts of yourself back home. And that is what the awakening process is. It totally shifts your consciousness, and it totally shifts your contact experience. Therefore, if we are going to give you homework for this particular video, we're going to ask you to ponder these ideas that we have talked about, and especially even make your own cardboard thing if that helps you, to help you understand this idea that there really is only one consciousness in creation. And every single being that you see around you in your world, those who are fast asleep and those who are very awakened, are still aspects of that one consciousness. And this understanding is vital to the awakening of consciousness on Earth. You are moving toward it already, as evidenced by the many, many hundreds of you doing CE5, or Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, meditation contact work, who are beginning to have these types of highly strange experiences in contact and not really knowing how to interpret them. As you get higher, they are harder to interpret, because basically they are all aspects of one consciousness. So continue with your meditations, continue with your contact work, and we hope what we have said will give you the confidence to begin to embrace perhaps some of those strange experiences that you've had that you don't understand, because you are moving back toward the one. All right? Until next time then, we send you much love.